Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burak of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. He is a research associate at the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise at the University of Kentucky. He is an economist, speaker, and commentator. Also, he works with Young Voices and Dissident. He's a content contributor. In February of 2019, he penned an op-ed about him and his family escaping socialism in Venezuela that was very popular. That's how I found him back then, from USA Today, called "Venezuela Was My Home and Socialism Destroyed It. Slowly, it will destroy America too." Daniel Martino, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So, Daniel, for my listeners who are not familiar with you, you're pretty new on the scene the last couple of years. Excellent piece that you put out last year about you and your family getting out of Venezuela before it was too late. So can you talk about your background, you and your family growing up in Venezuela? Why did you decide to leave? How bad things got before you decided to leave?
Of course. So I was born in 1999. I'm 21 years old. And I was born in Venezuela, in Maracay, which is in central Venezuela, about 2 hours, 3 hours away from Caracas, the capital. And well, that was the same year that Hugo Chavez came to power in our country. Hugo Chavez is the deceased dictator who died of cancer in 2013. Well, allegedly, we think that he died in 2012 at the end, but that's another matter. He destroyed our country, and it was an incredible change for me and my family, what we went through, because in the year 2000, we were making something, my parents were making something like $3,000 a month, which is something that is common. You know, it's not strange at all for Americans to be making, and was not strange for Americans to be making in the year 2000. But as time went by, we saw our income decline to extreme poverty levels almost, to just a matter of a couple dollars per day by 2016. Why did that happen? Because the government took over almost every sector of the economy. Inflation went up incredibly, and our income was capped because of price controls in our gas station of gasoline prices. And therefore, inflation consumed dollar income, and our real purchasing power went down, and we became poorer every year. That's what persuaded me to study economics, hyperinflation, shortages, because I had to make lines to buy food, because I didn't have electricity most days or water most days. And so that persuaded me to study economics, to come to America, apply for scholarships, and you know, thanks be to God, I obtained it and was able to afford to come thanks to that. And now I graduated in December. Ever since I came to America, I've spoken about socialism because I think that it is my duty as somebody who experienced it in Venezuela to protect America from going the same way, and that I have something to contribute to protect this country so that it doesn't go the same way of Venezuela. And that's what I do, and that's what I love to do, and will continue to do for the rest of my life.
So here in Wikipedia, it says that the hyperinflation started in 2016, and by 2014, the official inflation rate, well, I guess unofficial because the government was probably lying about it, but a lot of foreign economists say it reached about 69%, and it was the highest in the world then. And then 2015, it was 181%. So clearly it was increasing at an increasing rate. Did you notice the currency devaluation and that your bills were going up long before 2014 and 2015?
Of course. Before 2015 and 2014, inflation was already over 20% most years, and 30% many times too. So that's not little inflation, Jason. The United States' highest official inflation rate was in the 1970s, when it reached about 13%. That would be a joke today in Venezuela. We have 13% inflation every day. You know, there are many days where we have 13% inflation. I saw how the price of things like empanadas, if you're familiar with them, which is a very common food in Venezuela, in my high school cafeteria went up every week, and how I had to bring more cash, and how it was not, at the end, I couldn't fit enough cash in my wallet, and I had to pay with a credit card, and that's how things changed.
So what was the government's official inflation rate during that time when you said the real inflation rate was like 20 or 30%? Was the government saying there was no inflation? Was the government saying there was only like 2, 3, 4, 5% inflation? How bad do you think the economic propaganda was from the Venezuelan government? And did the propaganda, the lies about the economy and the currency, did it continue to get progressively worse?
So they actually didn't lie about the inflation rate for most of the time. For over 10 years, inflation was pretty much the same as estimated by private sources as by the government. It was later that they decided to just hide the information. And most recently, they stopped lying about, or at least they stopped hiding the official inflation figures, because I guess they just see no more value in hiding them. It's not like it matters, right? They know everybody knows there's inflation. They see it every day, and they don't need popular support. So who cares if people know? I think that they have just become so authoritarian at this moment that they don't really care if people know, if people don't like them, because they can keep staying in power because they have the weapons and we're defenseless.
So how did the economy change as inflation was getting worse? Was there lots of wage and price controls? Was there a noticeably increasing amount of corruption where Chavez was just handing over businesses to his friends in the bureaucracy or the military? What was actually going on during that time with the inflation? Was the government just making things even harder just to earn a living?
So let me give a little context and tell people specifically what were the policies that destroyed our country, and we can talk about what caused inflation and what happened after that. In the late 1990s, we had free market reforms that really improved Venezuela's economy that was in shambles in the 1980s and early 90s because of other issues with oil prices and excessive intervention in the economy. We were never, in shambles like we are now, right? But we were in a recession. There was relatively high inflation too, back then in the late 80s and early 90s. These free market reforms including opening the oil sector to private investment. They included ending subsidies for things like gasoline and other basic goods, ending price and wage controls. All of this liberalization and also balancing the budget, all of this reduced inflation in our country from over 100% to about 10% in the beginning of Chavez's term. This was done by Chavez's predecessor. And when Chavez came into power, he basically backtracked all the free market reforms. He still was able to ride along the results of those in the first couple of years, but then he started passing laws that confiscated property, specifically land. That was the first target of his, confiscating agricultural land. And then he implemented something which is an exchange rate control system. So our currency was tied to the dollar, and the government decided to set the official exchange rate. But they did not set the official exchange rate by manipulating the market, by selling reserves or actually trying to target the market rate. No, they just put an arbitrary number that no matter what's the demand or the supply, people have to do that number and they go to jail. That's what they did. And because the government controlled the oil industry, they were able to control most of the dollars that came from exports. And so they just gave those dollars away to whomever they wanted at very overvalued or subsidized prices. And all the government cronies got those dollars for cheap and then sold them in the black market and became multimillionaires through the currency system. The unintended consequence was that the government that received all this revenue in US dollars now was receiving a lot less revenue in national currency because they overvalued it through the control system. And so government revenue went down and Chavez started increasing spending in welfare programs. And so this massive deficit was covered initially by debt. So inflation didn't go up as much, but people were not lending the government anymore, and they just started printing in the central bank. And that's when inflation started creeping up from 10% to 15 to 20 to 30, and it was just a progressive destruction. Chavez, to control all of this, imposed price controls and increased the minimum wage uncountable times. And that's just piled on the problem, right? When price controls were imposed, I had to, I remember when I was very little, the earliest memory I have from shortages was when we went weeks without milk because the government had imposed price controls on milk and hadn't updated them. And so that's what price controls made, right? There's no profit incentive, so milk production shuts down. and there are lines of people, and so that destroys the economy even further. And increasing the minimum wage destroys small businesses, and so there's less jobs, and the economy goes into recession. And that's how our country was destroyed. It's policy after policy of socialism.
And we're seeing that now, too, with more and more intervention and more distortion with rules, regulations, taxes, minimum wage laws, all these different things layered on here in the U.S. Now, some states are worse than others. Like, I'm from California. I wasn't born there, but I grew up there. I lived 16 years in Southern California. I left years ago. But from friends that are still in the state, it sounds like it's headed very far down the path of socialism right now.
Yeah, well, I think that there are big differences in certain policies, right? Here, the price controls are not really widespread as they were in Venezuela, right? You know, the price of milk or eggs or basic goods is not controlled by the federal government or even state governments. And price controls are really an insidious policy that must never be implemented, which is why I get scared when I see radical Democrats proposing things like rent control, because that is surely going to have a devastating impact on the economy. Nobody's going to be able to find apartments to rent. And that's what happened in Venezuela. Rent was also capped, by the way. Nobody rents. And they imposed things like the right to housing in Venezuela. So if you were to move into an apartment that you were renting and you decided to stop paying rent, nobody could evict you. So nobody rented any apartments any longer, right? Because they were afraid they would invade them, which is how we call them, an invasion. And that's why I'm very concerned when I hear things like the right to healthcare, the right to housing. Those are not rights, your property is your right.
I totally agree, because a lot of those people who are demanding free healthcare, free education, they're not paying taxes. So the taxpayer, the person who's saving in dollars, is going to be absolutely hurt if the government decides that they're going to create more dollars out of thin air and just start giving people all this free stuff. The costs are going to rise. What also worries me too is taxes, not just the inflation tax, currency devaluation. So in Venezuela, Daniel, was Chavez, with the currency devaluation and the inflation that was happening, was he also raising taxes? Were new taxes being created? Were existing taxes being increased? Was that happening too?
That really didn't happen big time at all. We do have a income tax and we do have a sales tax in Venezuela, but tax evasion is really widespread. And most people don't really pay taxes. The only tax people pay somewhat is the sales tax, and they still evade it. So the way for the government to get revenue of the people in our country was not taxes, it was inflation. So they just printed money. But it's the same final effect, right? Inflation is a tax. And that's what Chavez did to raise revenue, taxes. So inflation as a tax.
So how bad did the food shortages get before you left? So you talked about milk. How bad were because I think a lot of people who have looked at this, there's documentaries out there from Real Vision TV. They put out a fantastic one for free on their YouTube channel in the last year or two. And I've seen videos and pictures of just empty shelves at supermarkets. So it wasn't just milk. It got worse and worse to where the shelves were empty and there was hours-long lines at supermarkets to get anything, and they didn't have the goods. Very similar to what happened in the Soviet Union decades ago.
Right. So we didn't have most things. The thing that was the saddest, I think, for me was that I remember products from my childhood that started disappearing as I grew older. Things like a specific brand of jelly, things like this type of cookie, things like, this brand of bottled juice, things like that started disappearing, and that's what the small things, right? But then you don't see flour, and you can only buy 2 pounds of flour if you go to the supermarket, and then it's 1, and then it's half a pound, and then there's a rationing for every product, and it gets into fights in the supermarkets. I remember one time I was with my dad and my mom in a supermarket, and we were buying toilet paper, which is a famous thing. Everybody talks about toilet paper shortages because it's a little funny, but it's serious. People need toilet paper. It's an essential good. And we were buying it, and my dad pays, but after he pays, the cashier notices that she allowed us to buy more than it was allowed by the quota. And so she tells my dad, "You have to give that back." And he's like, "I already paid. I'm not giving back anything." And she's like, "I'm going to call the National Guard," which Jason, the National Guard is in every supermarket in our country. That's how militarized and controlled they have us, right? Which is ridiculous, a police state. And so my dad takes the toilet paper and then he opens it up and throws it all over the floor and tells the cashier, "Go wipe your ass with this. I don't care about this." So sorry for the word, but it's a funny and real story. And fights like this occur every day in Venezuelan supermarkets. Even sadder is that there are fights between the customers because there's only one item left, and they fight over who got there first. And people have died in supermarkets in Venezuela over this.
Yeah, thanks for the antidote. To add to your points there, I mean, I've heard of stories of people getting killed at the Caracas airport now, foreigners, because they had dollars or they had euros. So people are desperate for foreign currency. I've heard stories of people who had bags of flour or dollars getting held up at knife point or gunpoint. And a lot of foreign tourists who went into Venezuela still from other countries. I think like there was some type of restrictions, I think, for Americans. But I had some Canadian friends who went down to Caracas and they were staying in some hotels and they were talking about how scared the security guards were because I think guns were banned, but going out on the streets, there was lots of gangs and criminals with weapons.
Yes. So to your point about, foreigners should not travel to Venezuela. You will be easily spotted because you are obviously not aware of the surroundings, and that happens, that's normal. People usually don't know that Venezuela, Caracas, is the city with the highest murder rate in the world. So this is, like going to Afghanistan or going to a war zone without there being a military war. And so it's very, very dangerous, and they will kill you. It's a type of crime that even if they take your money, they still kill you because they're soulless, because there is no type of repercussions for criminals in our country. Chavez destroyed and Maduro continued the destruction of our judicial system, so people don't go to jail. And if they go to jail, it's a reward. From jail, they actually organize and rule the whole country. There are jails where there are chicken farms or banks inside the jail. The jails are not controlled by police. They're controlled by the gang members. They're like safe havens for criminals. So it's actually better for the criminals to be in jail than outside. And yes, to your point, there are, even though it's illegal to own firearms, all the criminals are armed. It is the regular people who are not. The regular criminals are actually armed with Kalashnikovs and other Russian-style weapons, which makes you wonder, where did they get them? Because they usually come from the government.
Yeah, to add to your points there's a lot of kidnappings and ransoms in Venezuela. There was a Major League Baseball player, Wilson Ramos, who played here for the Washington Nationals local team. And I think he was kidnapped and held for ransom for a short period of time. I think it was a couple months. This was a few years ago.
Yes, kidnappings are very common. Unfortunately, my aunt was kidnapped. And this is a real true story, what I'm going to tell you. She was kidnapped and she decided to report it to the police. Most people don't report it because they know nothing's going to be done. She went to the police station and there's like a desk where they, you talk to the police officer in charge there to report the crime. And the police officer that comes is one of the kidnappers, Jason. I'm not kidding. Oh my God. This is very common in Venezuela. She, of course, then said that she was confused about where to go. She asked for directions, right? She didn't, and she tried not to show in her face that she knew that was the kidnapper. She left and never went back, and he obviously was terrified. But this is very common. In Venezuela, the police are police officers by the day and criminals by the night. When I was learning how to drive, I got pulled over by a police officer, and I was never as scared in my life as when I was pulled over by the police. I thought they wanted to kidnap me and ask me for money. I thought that's what was going to happen. It happens all the time. Another form of crime that happens is motorizados. There are people in motorcycles that are very common in our country, and they come between the cars, and then they knock on your window with their gun, and they tell you to give them everything, and they just start robbing every car in the traffic.
Also, I've seen pictures and video of robberies of government food delivery trucks. So those robbers are on the streets, are setting up barricades, and then the government, which is supposed to be delivering food, either the food is spoiled that's delivered in the trucks, or people are robbing and hijacking the food delivery trucks.
What I've seen more is just trucks that for some reason get accidented on the road. They are out of gas, or something happens to their wheel, something happens to whatever part of the truck, and they have to stop. And when they do, it is that people come out and just take everything from the truck. And that happens in part because, of course, there's impunity and there's no protection of private property rights, but also in part because people are so poor and desperate that they're going to take food wherever they can.
So I'm seeing articles for the last few years that because of subsidized electricity, Bitcoin mining and cryptocurrency is becoming very popular in the black market and underground economy in Venezuela. So people can buy goods from outside of Venezuela because they can't get dollars to purchase them, but they can use crypto and buy it online. But it looks like the police now in Venezuela are starting to seize some of these Bitcoin mining rigs. A new story came out today that the Venezuelan government and police, I think, seized 315 Bitcoin mining rigs in Venezuela.
Yes, in fact, I have a friend that did that. It's a good source of revenue. So as the country has become much poorer, people have tried to find ways to not starve, and some people even rent the Bitcoin machine, and it's become a market. It's very interesting how markets work underground. And because you're right, electricity is practically free, and even if it's not free, you can just steal the electricity from a cable and it will be free. That's the main cost of Bitcoin, aside from the machine for producing it. So Venezuela became one of the main producers of Bitcoin, even though it's a very poor country. However, as you say, not only is the government an obstacle because they're going to steal them, but they're not going to steal them to destroy them. They're going to steal them, and then the police are going to use them for themselves. Don't worry. So it's not like they're going to be destroyed. They're going to keep producing Bitcoin. It's just going to be someone else. And the other big obstacle that mining Bitcoin has in Venezuela is that even though electricity is free, it's unreliable. As you know, there are many blackouts in the country. If you will have a blackout in a regular building where you're not doing anything strange, imagine if you have Bitcoin machines. And the Bitcoin machines can go bad if there are many blackouts because they destroy the system, just like it happens with televisions and fridges.
So now I want to ask you about free speech in Venezuela. So was there free speech when Chavez took over? Did he start eliminating it? Because I've seen videos, there's lots of videos over the years of large protests in the streets in Venezuela. I think a lot of it's over food and currency. So what happened with freedom of speech and the ability to protest and private property rights and rule of law in Venezuela? Were these things all systematically eliminated under Chavez and Maduro?
So it's important to know that in Venezuela, there are protests, right? And it's not like in Cuba where if one person protests, there's no protest, right, in Cuba, where they just put everyone in jail. In Venezuela, there are massive protests, but only it's in massive protests that you can actually do something. Because if you go by yourself to the street with a sign and the police sees you, they're going to detain you. So it has to be like a massive convocation. And when that happens, even then, the police just kills a few people. And when they do, everybody else runs to their home and it ends. And that's why protests have never achieved anything in our country, because protests are just that. People in the street yelling, and that's not going to change who governs the country. Who governs the country is who has the guns. And Maduro has the guns.
So was there cancel culture or what's happening now in the US? Elizabeth Ruggiero, she's been talking about how statues were taken down in Venezuela and a lot of cultural Marxism and freedom of speech was gone, and very similar to what Karl Marx and George Orwell said. So was all of Venezuela's history systematically destroyed and ruined by Chavez and Maduro, saying that was the past, it doesn't matter? Basically the Marxist playbook. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So, cancel culture, as we see today, that's a different thing. Social media has mostly developed this now. I never saw anything with people being canceled for their beliefs, because also most people actually are against the regime. So it's not like they can't get canceled for that. But regarding history, that did happen. Chavez basically sequestered, he kidnapped her history, and he became this guy who, Bolivarian, right? That's why our country's name was changed to Bolivarian Republic rather than just a republic. And Bolivar was like our George Washington. So Chavez hails our founder as if he was a god. He has desecrated his remains. He has gifted his sword to other people. And he has, made our history as if it was his. And he even changed the face of our George Washington, of Simon Bolivar. And he came up with this study, and he made this new picture of him that we have never seen before that looks a lot like Fidel Castro. I kid you not. So that's what he did. He changed our flag. He changed our official shield of the country. So our horse that was the horse was like riding to the right and then looking to the left. He changed everything so that the horse was riding to the left. And he added an 8th star to our flag, which is completely historically inaccurate because the 7 stars of our original flag that we've had for many, many, many decades represent the 7 original colonies that united to form Venezuela. Chavez added the 8th, which is a colony that was never one of the original. It was one that we had to conquer because it was actually that colony actually sided with the Spaniards in the War of Independence. So Chavez did all of this so that we could lose our identity as a nation and he could reform it all.
Did he start throwing people in prison who tried to speak out against this, like history professors or people who care about your culture and your history? Were they ruined financially? Were they kidnapped at night? Were they thrown in prison? What the dissidents who were trying to speak out saying you shouldn't be doing this? We even if there were bad things in our history, we still need to learn from our history.
Well, that wasn't really the main battle we had. We had more important battles to fight, like our economic survival battle for capitalism. People in general were thrown in jail for their dissent. More recently, people have been thrown in jail for tweeting. There was a girl, she was, I don't remember her name, but her nickname was like La Terrible, the terrible. And she was taken by police for tweeting against the government and disappeared. And, there's tortures, there's rapes. If you just, and this is not, rogue officers. This is systematic training. And why do I tell you this? Because if you look at videos of what the National Guard does to people who they catch and they record and publish, because that's how these, sick these people are. They themselves record themselves and post it because they're sick people. They do the same type of torture to everyone, and that's not a coincidence. It has to be trained.
Yeah, it happens in China. It happens in a lot of totalitarian governments. Now, on your Twitter, you've talked about how Venezuela is a narco state now. Does that mean that Venezuela, to replace the oil revenues that have been lost with the rapidly declining oil production in the last 15 or 20 years, is Venezuela involved heavily, the Venezuelan government heavily involved in the drug trade then?
Oh, 100%. Ever since Chavez came to power, it's been a fast transition to become a drug dealing country. We stopped cooperating with the Drug Enforcement Administration, of course. And when I say that it's become a drug dealing country, I don't mean the regular citizens, but I mean the government regime officials. So you can see people like the nephews of Maduro who are now in jail in New York because they tried to smuggle tons of cocaine from Haiti to the United States. It is a well-known fact how all these small planes fly from Venezuela's west territories towards Colombia, towards Central America, and even Mexico to deliver cocaine so then it can be exported to Mexico. A lot of government planes and government vehicles are used to transport drugs. There are people who have defected from the regime who have testified that they were told by Chavez himself to work with organizations like FARC and ELN, which are narco-communist groups in Colombia, the famous guerrilla groups, right? The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and the National Liberation Army are their names in English. They basically want to take over the South America. transform it into a communist country, and they use narco trafficking to finance their terrorist activities. And Chavez has cooperated with them, giving them a safe haven in our territory so that they can keep doing attacks in Colombia, our neighbor nation. And it's incredible. This is like all the evil in the world came together, Jason, to destroy our way of life.
Yeah, this is like the textbook example of where government just goes totally off the rails, desperate. It started with the economy, problems in the economy. Government becomes more desperate. Government starts changing the rules. Government starts taking more power. You talked about the torture. I mean, those torture videos, which you said are sick, that's probably done intentionally, posted online to scare other people so they don't speak up, so they don't say this is wrong.
That's right. The reason the drug dealing happens is because oil revenue was very important as oil prices went up, but they also destroyed the oil industry, right? Because it was government owned and they wanted to spend a lot of money and they wanted to steal a lot of money. So they stopped spending on maintenance of the oil wells and refineries. So now we don't even produce enough gasoline for ourselves. And our oil production has historic lows, like when oil was discovered at the beginning of the 20th century. That's how crazy our economy has been destroyed. So they are not getting rich through oil anymore. Maduro is not making money from oil. All the members of the regime are not. They're making money from drug dealing, and they're making money from fees that they get paid from organizations like Hezbollah that they allow to operate in our territory, and they're making money from mining, illegal mining in gold, of everything you can think of. There's even uranium, and they have invited the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians to come and exploit those resources.
From someone on the outside, and I've read a lot of articles and I've listened to interviews and read the press releases of deals with China and Russia involved in Venezuela. Also, I think Iran has oil service deals with Venezuela where Venezuela had to pay in gold because they didn't have any dollars. It seems to me like, for our listeners who are not familiar with this, Venezuela has the most oil reserves. So yes, it's heavy sour crude, but the Gulf refineries here in the US are set up to refine that. That's what they want. And yet it's not happening. It seems like the Russians and the Chinese now are basically ready to steal all of Venezuela's oil assets and reserves, but the Venezuelan oil industry is a total disaster.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And something else I want the listeners to know is that sometimes the left here wants to lie to Americans and tell them, well, what happened in Venezuela was not because of socialism, was because these are drug dealers and corrupt people. And so they dismiss the socialism argument. And what I have to tell to these people is that that's not really the truth. There are many examples of narco states and corrupt states in the world that are not going through what Venezuela is going. I'm not saying that didn't contribute to the regime staying in power. Of course it did. But the reason the people are economically miserable is because of price controls, because of hyperinflation that is caused by overspending and the currency controls and socialist policies at the end, right? Nationalization of businesses, taking them away of overspending in welfare. That's socialism. And I can give you examples. Countries like Iran, Jason, are very corrupt, are highly sanctioned, in case you think that sanctions are the reason for a crisis. And they're definitely involved in terrorism. The people of Iran are not 96% under the poverty level or 80% extremely poor. They're not doing well, but they're not starving in the street like Venezuelans are. Colombia is a very corrupt country. Brazil, all Latin American countries are very corrupt. African countries are corrupt. Our country, just this week, we had the new survey of poverty by one of the private universities show that 96% of Venezuelans are poor and 80% are under extreme poverty, making less than $2 per day. So the only people who are not poor in our country, that 4%, are basically the people who are with Maduro, are the regime officials. So if you are not poor in Venezuela today, you're corrupt. That's what socialism made to our country. It made us all equally poor.
Do you think subsidized gasoline also helped destroy the Venezuelan oil industry? Because that's creating artificial demand, lots more demand because people aren't paying a market price and then the oil industry isn't making a profit. And then they're not, like you said earlier, reinvesting that profit back into the oil business to lower costs, maintain property, plant, and equipment, whether that's oil wells or oil refineries. It seems a lot of it started with subsidizing gasoline, and Venezuela could not export that at one point the oil production was 4 million barrels per day. Venezuela was a top 6 or 7 in the world oil producer, and now what you said, they're not even a net exporter of oil anymore.
So that was a big item line in our budget. And yes, that contributed to the budget deficit, which contributed to printing money, which led to inflation and poverty. Yes. However, and it obviously led to more consumption of gasoline, but that's not really the main issue. Also gasoline demand is relatively inelastic. And when the country's economy goes bad, there's also less cars. So it's not as much about gasoline demand as about how much the government didn't receive in revenue by having to subsidize this. And I can tell you very well how this works because my family owned a gas station in Venezuela, in the country, right? So how the subsidy scheme that Chavez set up works is that before, while we were making money from just like a regular business, selling and buying the gasoline and then selling them to the customers and just pocketing the profit, now how it works is that you just sell gasoline and the government pays you based on those sales, however they want. And that's in domestic currency, not in US dollars. That subsidy increased by amounts smaller than inflation every year. And that's why our income went down in real terms. And so gasoline stations were destroyed. Most recently, Maduro actually took out the subsidy. So right now, since last month, there are no gasoline subsidies in Venezuela because they had to cut it. The Maduro is not, the country's budget is really destroyed because of the drop in oil production, the official budget, right? Not the corrupt. They make money with drug dealing.
Oh, I was just going to say, if the currency is falling that much and you're not earning dollars, if Venezuela's economy is not diversified, and that's the problem with a lot of these oil producing countries, is they're way too reliant on oil in their economies. They don't start to take those oil profits and build other industries and have some diversification in case the oil price crashes or in case a new energy source is phased in and oil is phased out in the coming 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Right, but that's so why I give the Iran example, because I think Iran is an excellent comparison of what a country that, even though yes, they're not a free market haven, but they're not definitely as socialist as Venezuela in taking over businesses and putting price controls and raising the minimum wage, controlling the currency, etc. And because of that, even though they are just as highly or more sanctioned than Venezuela, Iran. They are an oil-dependent nation. They are corrupt and terrorist. They are an authoritarian country, right? Elections are not really that free. They are still better than Venezuela because they are not as socialist as Venezuela. And my whole point with this is that, yes, corruption is bad and all of these things are bad, but socialism is the reason people are starving in the streets. And socialism itself also fuels corruption because who is corrupt? The government officials. And how can they steal money? By controlling more of the economy. You need to take away control from the government if you want them not to even have the chance to steal anything. You can't just wish they are nice people, right? Even politicians in America steal, right? If you give them more power, they're going to steal more.
Yeah, I completely and totally agree. I mean, I think if Venezuela wants to fix things, they need to start re-implementing more capitalism, more free markets, more entrepreneurship, which means they're going to have to allow foreign investment. They're going to have to allow foreign oil companies with private property rights to come in and help repair the Venezuelan oil industry. And it's not going to be a quick fix. It's going to be a long-term fix, a long-term solution. It's going to take time. But ultimately, private property rights are what allows the economy and investment to improve.
But I'm actually more optimistic. I think that if Venezuela were to be free and the right measures were to be implemented, which that's the real question, whether the measures are implemented, if we privatize the things that were nationalized and we stop the deficit spending and money printing, inflation can be controlled pretty quickly, like countries like Germany did, like other Latin American countries in the 20th century did, controlling their hyperinflations. So this is no secret. All economists know how to control hyperinflation. You just have to stop printing money. And once you do that, or dollarize the economy, like it's already happened in Venezuela, by the way, but just not officially, because people are just not confident in our currency. So there are easy fixes to improve people's quality of life quickly. and with humanitarian aid to stop people from starving in the short term, and allowing privatizing and allowing more investment, and stopping the expropriations, fixing the judicial system, ending these crazy regulations that our country has, that can easily bring so much more investment, because it's very cheap to produce in Venezuela. Wages are going to go up when investment comes in, and people are going to stop earning starvation wages.
Yeah, private property rights and rule of law are very important for an economy. And if those are increasing, if people are getting better private property rights and rule of law is maintained in the court system to protect property, to protect freedom of speech, to protect small business owners and entrepreneurship, then normally the economy is going to be a lot more stable. If the exact opposite is happening, then it's going to be worse. But what do you mean by dollarizing for our listeners? So I know you know what that means, but what for my listeners who are not familiar with that, does that mean then that there's basically a black market economy and people don't want to accept the Venezuelan currency? They want US dollars, and there's like an underground black market economy then for dollars?
That's right. In fact, most transactions in Venezuela are already happening in US dollars and not in international currency. And that's, people for a long time have wanted to do this, but there were just not the dollars in circulation. But as millions of Venezuelans like myself have emigrated from the country and have sent back remittances, people now have the US dollars to trade. And they even use things like Zelle, Zelle, the payment facility. They use PayPal. They use American credit cards. They use US dollars in cash. And they pay in supermarkets with US dollars in cash. I've seen pictures, I've seen videos. I have family members, I have friends there who tell me all of this.
And they get sorry to interrupt you. Can they get in trouble though? So if there's like the military there, or the police or government agent, if they get caught paying in dollars, are they risking their lives? Are they risking prison? Are they risking someone pulling a gun on them?
Not anymore. Well, pulling a gun, yes, to steal, but not because it's illegal or anything. It's illegal, but it's not. The government is not enforcing the law anymore. They have just kind of accepted that a lot of the economy is just dollarized, and they're not trying to tax it. They're not trying to tax it. You know what they say, if it moves, tax it. That's the government's motto. And they're trying to figure out how. I just don't know whether it's feasible.
So this is an incredible interview, Daniel. My listeners are going to get a lot out of this, just incredible insights. You speak like you're 30 or 40 years old with your knowledge and experience. So thank you very much for your time. The last question here before I let you go, and a lot of people ask me this. So a lot of my listeners who are Americans are small government, or some of them are anarcho-capitalists, but small government, freedom of speech, pro-capitalism, pro-free markets. What do you think Americans who are freedom-loving, like capitalism, don't want government to be too big, don't want to pay too much in taxes, what can they do to stop all of the crazy stuff that's been happening the last 2, 3, 4 months here in the US with Marxist protesters, statues being toppled, and it's not just statues of founding fathers, there's abolitionists and others. There's Frederick Douglass, I think his statue was just taken down, which doesn't make a bunch of sense to me. But what do you think Americans, some maybe practical solutions based on what your experiences in Venezuela, Americans can do to maybe prevent this from getting worse here in the US?
Well, one big thing is to not kneel in front of the mob. In Venezuela, a big problem was that people were not willing to speak out at the beginning of Chavez's terms. And many people didn't take it as seriously as they should have. They, even my parents, they never thought this was going to get us bad. They never supported Chavez, they voted against him, but they never thought it was going to turn into a socialist dictatorship. But some people did. And some people warned in Venezuela that it was going to turn like Cuba. So they were worse than Cuba. Because Chavez and other people told us Venezuela was never going to become like Cuba. We're not an island. Come on, we have oil. We're a democracy. We can't elect our way into Cuba. Come on, right? And that's exactly what happened. This can happen. And in Venezuela, people didn't speak out. So always be willing to speak out. Don't get silent. And I don't mean speak out on social media. That's important. But speak with others who support this. And tell them about, what you think, and read and investigate and try to persuade them. I say that we have to be evangelizers for the free market. yes, we can, of course, evangelize about Christianity and our religion if you are religious, but we have to evangelize about freedom, because that's what's going to keep our country free. And not just talking to people. You see now people toppling the statues. Go and defend them. Go outside and defend of course, if you believe in the statue, right? If it's something like George Washington, of course, go and defend it. Or, Frederick Douglass, the founding fathers. We have to show that Americans are not just the few loud voices who are either, on the far right or on the far left, that there's people here who support freedom. And so speak out in college campuses. If some of your listeners are college students, don't get silent because one of your college professors just promotes leftist propaganda. I've stood up to my professors in college when I was in college, and I've told them what I thought. And I've told it in front of the class. I even told one professor who told me that Venezuela was not bad because of socialism. I told him, you can just switch places with me and go live there. I told him in front of the class. And then we can see what you think, because you obviously know more than I do, right? And that's a challenging thing to tell to a professor. And what are they going to do to you? Are they going to lower your grades? Big deal. It's not going to happen. You have to stand up for yourself. That's what God would want us to do, and that's what we need to do if we're going to keep America the free nation it is.
Well, the U.S. was built on people who spoke up, right? People who spoke truth to power, truth to authority. I mean, most people don't realize this now because they don't study history anymore, but the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were all risking execution just by signing a document. So they were going to get hanged or shot.
Exactly. We don't even have those same stakes right now, and many people are still afraid of speaking out. So people have to shake off that fear and be brave, because if we're not, we're going to be sad that in the future we didn't do it at this time when the cost was very low, and in the future the cost of speaking up will be much greater, like it is today in Venezuela.
And this is something that famous economist Ludwig von Mises advocated for many, many years of his life, because he had to escape Nazi-occupied Austria just to write a lot of his economic books. But I think one of the main problems, Daniel, is that in society right now, a lot of people who claim to hate capitalism don't even know what capitalism is, can't even give up a definition. And yet capitalism is often blamed for most, if not all, of the problems in society. But what we have now, I would say, is enormous government distortions with rules, regulations, taxes, red tape. But it's very convenient for the left and big government to just blame capitalism when they screw up. And that's how they consolidate even more power.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that's what happened in Venezuela. It didn't happen from one day to the next. It happened gradually. And that's how they destroy your country nowadays. In the past, it was with violent revolutions that just overthrew the government and took over property in the next day. Now, it's progressively taking away your freedoms while you sleep, while you are not willing to speak up about it. And when you want to speak up about it, and when you see that your freedoms are out, your freedoms are out. You can't even speak up about it. And so I don't want that to happen to America. I was too young to do something about it in Venezuela. I was born when the regime already started, but I'm not too young to do it in the United States.
Well, thank you so much for helping Americans who are born out here in the country. You are truly a great asset to this country now. But capitalism, what is happening right now, there is the theft is from taxes. I mean, taxes, and then the inflation tax, and the people in power. I don't know if you saw like the projected tax increases that may be coming in the 2020 election. I don't know how they're going to pay for it.
Yeah. I think that the fiscal situation of this country is in big trouble over the long term and even in the medium term. Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out of money probably around 2031, Medicare even sooner, perhaps 2025 or 2024. And so, in fact, the next president is probably going to have to reform Social Security and Medicare, and that's probably going to raise our taxes. I think they're going to raise taxes. The question is, are they going to reduce spending? I hope so.
I want to thank you so much for your time today, Daniel. You've given my listeners an incredible amount of wealth, knowledge, and experience about what has happened in Venezuela in the last couple decades. If my listeners want to follow your articles or follow you on Twitter, how do they do so?
Yeah, so just search for my name, Daniel DiMartino. My Twitter handle is @Daniel DiMartino. And my website, where you can see all of my articles, where you can see all of my TV interviews, is www.danieldimartino.com. You can also check me out on Facebook and Instagram, and it's always the same name, Daniel DiMartino. I'd be happy to have you as a follower.
Excellent. Well, you've done a great job today making people aware of what has really been happening in Venezuela in the last couple of decades, because unfortunately, I don't think the mainstream media is accurately covering this.
Unfortunately.